Dawn light bled into the mist that hung low over the gray New York train yard, a colorless hush stretching across the wet cobblestones. Thin, silent children huddled on long wooden benches, faces gaunt, eyes glassy, clutching scraps of fabric, worn dolls, one another. Steam hissed from the great black iron locomotive, rising in ghostly tendrils, wrapping around them like cold hands. A nun's voice cracked the heavy air, reciting names without tenderness, the syllables sharp as a whip. A boy coughed, a girl whimpered, neither acknowledged. No one asked for their mothers. Clara May Bishop sat stiffly at the edge of the bench, her fingers locked around the tiny bundle in her arms, a newborn swaddled in a strip of linen too thin for the chill. The infant's face was mottled, her breath, so light it barely fogged the morning air. Clara's own face was pale beneath a smear of soot, her blue eyes fixed on a soot-smeared window. Beyond it, the sky was turning the color of ash, the rising sun hidden behind a veil of gray. Beside her, a boy of 12 gripped her sleeve. His fingers were cold, skin cracked from the street. The nun's voice called his name. Clara did not turn. He whispered, low and desperate, "Don't let them take her, Clara." The shrill whistle of the orphan train split the air. Steam gushed from beneath the wheels, and the vast machine shuddered as it came to life. The boy's hand slipped from her sleeve, and his voice was lost in the rising noise of metal on metal. The city, with its crumbling brick buildings and narrow alleys, receded into shadow. Smoke swallowed it whole. Inside the rattling carriage, the air smelled of old wood, sweat, and sorrow. Rows of hard wooden benches stretched from one end to the other. Clara clutched the baby closer, feeling the fragile beat of the tiny heart against her ribs, her knuckles bone-white. The infant stirred, her mouth working soundlessly. A man in a long gray coat stood at the far end of the car, leaning against the wall, eyes narrow beneath the hat brim. He watched Clara too long, his gaze lingering. She turned away, tightening her grip on the bundle, her stomach tightening in a way she'd grown used to. A girl on the opposite bench, her face bruised and thin, lifted a tattered handkerchief and coughed into it. A spot of blood bloomed against the cloth. She folded it neatly in her lap, eyes vacant. The train lurched forward, wheels clattering into an endless rhythm, a sound without mercy. Time dissolved with it. Towns passed in a blink. Endless fields rolled by, pale and bare beneath the colorless sky. Clara didn't mark the hours. The baby cried a thin, desperate sound. The nun, seated at the front, didn't look up from her worn book. Clara rocked the infant gently, humming an old hymn, though the words meant nothing. It was something to fill the emptiness. At dusk, the train slowed near a small platform in Pennsylvania. A heavy-set woman with rough hands boarded, clutching a paper-wrapped parcel of bread. She sat near the door, never offering it to anyone. Hunger gnawed at Clara's gut, but she kept her head down. The baby's crying worsened. A small child, no more than 6, fell from an upper bunk, a dull thud against the boards. No one moved. The child lay there for a long moment, then curled against the floorboards, silent. The sky darkened. Cold crept in through the thin cracks in the walls. Clara whispered to the bundle in her arms, "Mercy." She said it once, so soft it was almost a breath. No one heard. No one answered. The baby's name. A name Clara had carried in her head from the moment she'd first seen the child, alone and wailing behind a tenement when the city police came for them. It had been cold then, too. The child's mother long gone, faceless, forgotten. Clara had lifted the baby from a pile of soiled rags and hadn't let go since. She hadn't spoken the name before now. The train rattled on through the night. A candle flickered at the far end, held by the nun, her face half in shadow, lips moving in quiet prayer. Clara didn't join. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. In its reflection, she saw only her own pale, hollow face and the ghost of the infant curled against her chest. The endless motion of the train dulled the ache in her arms, the sting of old bruises on her back. She closed her eyes for a moment. In the quiet, the wheels kept their relentless chant, asterisk gone. Gone. Gone, asterisk. Morning would come again. The train would stop. Someone would raise a hand, and Clara would be pulled from it. She knew it as sure as the sun would rise. But for now, here, In this narrow, rattling carriage between nowhere and nothing, she had mercy. And that would have to be enough. The train screeched to a halt in a nameless siding somewhere in Kansas, a plume of steam hissing from beneath the iron wheels as dust billowed up to meet it. The air was thick with heat and the bitter tang of churned earth, the scent of livestock and sweat. Dirt roads forked away from the tracks toward scattered, sun-bleached houses in the distance. The town itself was little more than a few leaning shacks and a clapboard church with a tilting steeple. A crowd had gathered by the tracks, men with sunburnt faces and weather-beaten hats, their wives with lined mouths and raw, apron-stained hands. A cluster of children barefoot in the dust, staring wide-eyed at the great black machine that had come howling from the east. A makeshift platform of rough boards had been laid beside the train, sagging in the middle. A man in a black hat, tall and narrow-shouldered, with a face like a worn axe handle, strode to its center. His voice carried across the clearing like a bark. "Off the train now, all of you." Inside the railcar, Clara May Bishop felt the words tighten around her throat. The baby in her arms stirred, a soft, fretful sound barely audible over the groan of metal and the shifting weight of restless children. A girl of perhaps 11 was the first to move, stepping down from the carriage. She was thin, the hem of her dress uneven, her eyes dulled by too many nights without sleep. A woman in the crowd reached out, a heavy arm marked with flour and old burns, and took the girl by the wrist without a word. No greeting, no question, just possession. One by one the children were herded off, blinking against the sharp sunlight, the dust clinging to their lashes and lips. Clara gripped the infant to her chest, her heart pounding against the fragile weight of the child's body. The baby whimpered and squirmed, the heat too much even in the shade of Clara's threadbare shawl. The man with the black had climbed onto the train step, boots thudding. His eyes settled on Clara. "You there, girl? Come along." Clara didn't move. She felt her legs lock beneath her. The man's hand shot out and seized her elbow in a grip like iron. The babe, too. From her seat by the window, the nun gave a brief nod without looking up from her faded prayer book. Her eyes seemed fixed on something far beyond the heat and dust of this place. Clara rose, feeling the pull of the man's hand and the weight of the baby against her. The sun hit her like a slap as she stepped down from the train. The world outside was blinding. A ring of townsfolk closed in around the platform, their faces indistinct in the haze of heat and dust. A rusted dinner bell hung from a splintered beam, clanged once by a pale-haired boy standing on tiptoe. Names were called, hands raised. A mute boy with tangled hair was led away by a rope knotted around his wrist. The baby in Clara's arms began to cry, a thin, desperate wail that sliced through the heavy air. A woman with a face like dried mud sneered, "Take the lot. Ain't worth much separate." The black hat man raised a hand for quiet. "This one here. Girl. 16. Pale. One infant. Work ready." A ripple of murmuring. No one stepped forward. Started $1. A man near the back spat tobacco into the dust. "I'll pay for the babe, not the girl." A laugh broke from another, a crooked smile beneath a battered hat. "I'll take her if she's clean." More laughter, sharp and mean. Clara's arms tightened around the child, her stomach lurching. The baby's wails came in ragged gasps, her small face blotched and red. A boy no older than 14 was yanked away by his hair, his feet scraping the platform. Clara lifted her gaze and met the eyes of a woman in the crowd. Dark hair streaked with gray, a narrow face, eyes too sharp to be kind. There was something there, something unreadable, not pity, not sympathy, something that passed between them in a heartbeat. The bidding stalled. No one wanted both. A farmer's wife leaned close to her husband. He shook his head without glancing up. The baby's crying didn't stop. "Separate M," someone called. The black hat man turned, his voice hard. "Auction the babe separate." Clara's voice cracked the air. "She's mine." The words landed in the dust and hung there. The crowd fell silent. Even the baby seemed to stifle for a breath. A boy leaning on crutches watched from the edge of the gathering, his face pale, one leg twisted beneath him. "Start again," the black hat man snapped. $1. The bell clanged. Another $1. The sun was high now, burning against the backs of necks and the tops of heads. Flies buzzed in lazy loops. Sweat clung to Clara's skin, her dress damp and heavy. The bidding dragged, the offers grudging, reluctant. A man in a gray coat stepped forward. The coat was fine once, though it bore stains dark and old, and his hands were smeared with something that might have been blood or oil. His face was long, his mouth tight. "I'll pay for both." A low murmur from the gathered townsfolk. A woman crossed herself. The bell clanged again. The man in the black hat nodded. A rope was brought and tied around Clara's wrist, rough hemp that bit into her skin. The baby was wrenched from her arms, handed to a woman whose hands were a web of thick blue veins, her face expressionless. Clara screamed then, a sound torn from her throat, so raw it left her shaking. A leather strap cracked across her back. The dust swallowed it all. The shack sat crooked on the edge of a patch of sun-bleached land, its walls slumping as though weary of standing against the wind. The roof was missing half its shingles, and what remained of the fence leaned like broken teeth against the empty prairie sky. Heat shimmered off the hard-packed earth, and no trees dared grow nearby. Coyotes called at night their high, lonesome howls carrying through the darkness, thin as thread. Clara May Bishop lived inside that shack now. The burlap shift clung to her skin, rough against the raw places on her back where the strap had landed. She moved like something hollowed out and half seen, her eyes as empty as the field stretching around her. The baby was gone. She didn't know where. She no longer asked. The days passed in a slow, blistering haze, marked by the crack of the lash and the rasp of the man's voice. He spoke few words. Clean. Fetch. Kneel. The air in the shack stank of sweat, blood, and old wood. Clara scrubbed floors until her fingers split, fetched water from a well half a mile out, lifted sacks of feed that left dark bruises across her arms. When the sun sank low and the prairie burned in colors of fire, she curled up in the corner against the splintered boards, her body aching. She could hear the coyotes then, and she remembered her mother's hands, the way they had once brushed hair from her face, the smell of soap and warmth and something long since lost. The man in the gray coat never took supper with her. He left his plate outside the shack door like a master feeding a stray, and she learned not to leave a scrap behind. When he spoke, the words landed like stones. His hands never missed their mark. One night, a storm rose over the flatland, sudden and furious. The sky went dark as ink, and the wind howled through the gaps in the walls. Rain poured through the missing shingles and puddled on the dirt floor. Clara stood barefoot in the mud, water running down her face, hair clinging to her skin. Lightning split the sky, and for a moment the world was white. In the flicker of that light, she saw him, a figure by the fence line, half hidden by the sway of tall grass. The boy from the auction, the one with the crutches. He limped forward, the crutch slipping in the mud, and in his hand he held a bundle wrapped in rough cloth. He didn't speak, only pressed it into her hands through the slats of the fence, his face pale, his eyes large and steady. Inside the cloth, a scrap of bread, hard and stale but precious beyond words, and a small, crumpled piece of paper, a single word written in a thin, clumsy hand. Mercy. Clara stared at it, her hands trembling. She buried the bread inside her shift against her ribs and folded the paper beneath it. She did not cry. When dawn came, the man found the note. She didn't know how. Perhaps the cloth had slipped, or maybe the wind carried it loose. A boot came down hard on her shoulder, sending her sprawling against the wet dirt. Her lip split against a stone. No words, only the weight of that boot and the sound of her own breathing. Days bled into one another. The heat and labor never changed. She lost track of time, of seasons, of herself. The barn burned one dry afternoon. Clara never knew how it started, whether by her own careless spark, or the wind, or the sun beating down on something dry as bone. The flames caught and roared, and when the man saw the smoke, his face twisted into something worse than rage. The strap came down again and again. When it stopped, Clara lay still in the dirt, blood pooling beneath her ear, the prairie sky spinning above her. That night, she drifted in and out of sleep, the ache in her body a dull roar. Thunder grumbled in the distance. The scent of scorched wood lingered. A sound came at the window, soft, deliberate. She forced her eyes open. A face in the glass. The woman from the auction. The one who hadn't pitied her, but had watched her. The glance in the crowd. And in the woman's arms, a small figure. A child. Mercy. The baby's face was thinner now, smudged and silent, but alive. A tiny hand reached out, fingers brushing Clara's wrist through the gap in the boards. Clara stifled a sob, her hand closing around the small one. The woman pressed her face close to the glass. Her lips moved, shaping a word. Tonight. The wind howled around the shack. Coyotes sang. Clara waited. Midnight came like a held breath. A soft hand on her arm pulled her up. The woman's eyes sharp and cold, her grip unyielding. Outside, the boy with crutches stood waiting, a bundle of clothes slung over his shoulder, his face set with something like defiance. A horse, thin and nervous, stamped in the grass nearby, its reins looped over a fence post. The woman placed the child in Clara's arms. Mercy was lighter than she remembered. Warm. The woman said nothing, only gave a curt nod. Clara felt the world narrow to that child's heartbeat, and the sound of her own breath. Then a sharp crack, a gunshot from the shack. The man awake. No time now. Clara ran. The boy with crutches hobbled after them, the woman lifting the child onto the horse's back. The wind whipped at their faces, the grass slicing their legs as they fled across the open fields. The prairie stretched in every direction, dark and endless. The stars scattered cold and bright overhead. Clara felt the child's breath against her throat, hot and steady. Behind them, the shack glowed with fire. Another blaze. It burned higher than the barn, smoke curling into the night, a beacon against the dark. The coyotes kept howling. Dawn found them at the edge of a river, the sky pale and colorless, the horizon smeared with the promise of heat. Fog hung low over the water, curling and coiling like smoke, clinging to the banks where cattails drooped and the earth turned to black mud. The river moved slow and wide, dark as slate, its surface broken only by the ripple of unseen things beneath. Clara stood barefoot at the water's edge, the hem of her burlap shift heavy with dew, plastered to her legs. The child was quiet against her chest, the tiny rise and fall of Mercy's breath barely felt beneath the cloth. The woman who'd come for them, the one from the platform with eyes that didn't pity, stood close, a thin line of sweat on her brow though the air was still. The boy with crutches knelt nearby, his face pale as wax, lips cracked. His crutch lay in the reeds. The night's run had drained what little was left of him, his chest heaving, eyes glassy. The woman reached out, pressing something cold and hard into Clara's palm, a single silver coin, dulled by years but shining now in the weak light. "Go south," the woman murmured. "Stay to the trees." No other words. There were none left. Somewhere behind them, the faint, steady rhythm of footsteps against dry grass. Dogs barking, closer now. No time. Clara's hands trembled as she crouched beside a hollowed log, half hidden in the rushes. She laid the baby inside, the child's pale face framed by damp cloth. The fog drifted around them, thick and unkind. Mercy whimpered once, a high thin sound. Clara gathered a handful of moss, soft and wet, and laid it over the child, tucking it close until only the tiniest patch of cheek remained. She bent low, pressing her lips to Mercy's brow, the skin there cool as morning stone. No words. A promise made in the quiet, a name carried forward. Then Clara turned and ran. Gunshots cracked through the branches, like dry bones breaking. The boy shouted, then fell, his crutch toppling into the water with a splash. Clara saw the red bloom on his chest, the way his face twisted once, then stilled. She stumbled, the ground tilting beneath her, her hands slick with blood that wasn't her own. The river rose to meet her. The world blurred, mist and gunpowder thick in the air, the yells of men lost in the water's hush. She felt the current catch her legs, pull her down. The weight of the river was endless, swallowing everything, sound, light, sky. The fog closed around them, thick and shapeless. When the chasing men reached the shore, there was nothing left. No girl, no boy. No woman. Only the log remained, half hidden among the reeds. The child's thin, muffled cry seeped through the moss and drifted out over the water, swallowed by the mist. A boatman drifting downstream, his craft a crooked thing of boards and pitch, heard it. He turned his head, peering through the fog, the sound striking a chord too old to name. He found the log, and within it, the bundle of cloth and moss. A child with pale hair and hollow eyes. A child that should not have survived the river's cold. The boatman cradled her to his chest, his calloused fingers brushing strands of hair from her brow. He asked no questions. A new name was given, not the one her mother spoke, not the one Clara whispered that night by the river, but it lived inside her, stitched into her bones. In a distant town, days and miles away, a woman with hands webbed in blue veins stood by the tracks. The train came as it always did, a hiss of steam and a shriek of metal, then gone. No one stepped down. The wind picked up across the platform, carrying with it the faintest echo of a name. Mercy. Years passed. Seasons came and left no mark. In a town far from the river, under a sky as wide as sorrow, a girl with hollow blue eyes stood alone on a platform. The wind teased her hair, the air thick with dust. A bell clanged somewhere down the tracks, and she did not flinch. The past clung to her like a shadow, stitched into her skin, threaded through the marrow of her bones. The story never told, but always there,